our collective life is unsustainable. We can't carry on like this. We have the impact of our action has a geological scale, is changing the climate, so we need to change.
Future Materials Encounters, live podcast from the Dutch Design Week.
Hello and welcome to this new podcast episode of the Future Materials Encounters. My name is Giulia Bellinetti and I am the coordinator of the Future Materials program at the Jan van Eyck Academy. We are recording this podcast from the Innovatie Lab exhibition at the Klokgebouw in Eindhoven, and today is the closing day of the Dutch Design Week of this year, 2023. So it's quite exciting and there are a lot of people around us. Today we will discuss with two guests materials and weaving techniques in relation to innovative technologies. And we will do this with Eline Busschen, who's here next to me, a yarn thinking designer, as she calls herself, interested in giving new life and value to waste streams. She contributed to the Future Materials Bank with her project Surplus, which combines discarded wool with 3D printing techniques, bioplastic filaments and natural pigments. In conversation with her, we have Pei-Ying Lin. Hello, Pei. Artist and designer whose research combines arts, science and social sciences to develop new tools and methods to investigate the boundaries between invisible and visible, living and non-living. She is currently doing a PhD research at the TU Eindhoven on AI technologies applied to weaving techniques. Eline, Pei, welcome. Did you enjoy the Dutch Design Week so far?
Yeah. Get to see a lot of interesting things and being really inspired.
Yeah, very nice projects. Yeah, especially also the lab here.
Great, thank you. So I think to start, would you like to introduce your reciprocal projects? So your PhD research and more broadly your practice, Pei, and your Surplus project, Eline.
So basically I have a mixed background where right now I'm researching into how human and AI can collaborate on the creative matters, mainly on knitting actually, but I'm treating the AI sort of like a non-human entity collaborator, and that's related with my previous work that I do a lot of projects with bacteria and viruses and see how working with these things can change our perspective and also our behavior. So how we are fundamentally changed by collaborating with the other non-humans.
My project Surplus was about using discarded wool in a different way, because in the Netherlands about 1 to 2 million kilos of wool are thrown away each year, and this mainly has to do with the fibers. They are too thick to weave in a commonly used way, so I decided to do non-wovens instead of woven materials, and in that process I started to use the 3D printer also as a sort of helping agency in my process, and according with that I also developed plastics with natural pigments.
And we have some samples by Eline here on the table. We might look at them more closely later, Eline.
Yeah.
But first, I'm very curious what actually fascinated me about both your project is also the ecologies that are created around them. Would you like to expand a bit more, and also if the ecology as a concept relates to your projects?
Yeah, well, for me it's really, I saw really in the process that I needed to shift my way of thinking also as a designer, because you tend to think of picking certain things and using them, but if you see yourself as a part of a bigger system and you see the other parts, for me for example the shepherd I worked with for the wool, and also the sheep themselves, because they are creating the wool. If you give them more agency in your project, then you can listen to the material a bit more close as well. So it's really, and I try to challenge that idea of how to function in such an ecology and in such a system as designer as well. Although sometimes it's you tend to think it's very common to have sort of human-centered thinking process.
So how is the project challenging your position as a designer?
Well, also, for example, like you always have this sort of balance between, like, if you work with natural materials, they always have like their own kind of way of living and their own kind of will. And on the other hand, also with using certain technologies, like, for example, the 3D printer, it's already really, like, simply when, like, you have a wobbly floor and, like, it moves over a bit, then it shifts. Or, like, when you have your indigo dye bed and you forget to feed it, so to say, then it will die. And in this sense, like, you tend to go care, like, for these, like, other elements in your project, just as you would, just as, like, they become these personalities almost.
And such as you would care for other human beings, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's like a different relation to the environment,
Yeah.
not unilateral. But
Yeah.
Pei, what about
Well, yeah, actually, so what I'm doing is how do you work on textile with AI, and what Eline mentioned, all the problems or all the actually nice prices, which is not the problems with the personality of the materials. It's also a challenge for the AI because very often, so with knitting, you can start with a pattern, and the pattern can be stored digitally in a certain way with 0 and 1 or a little bit of numbers. But all of these kind of things doesn't represent what the material will bring. So with the same pattern, if you use a different material, then it will like turn out to be something completely different. And I know that a lot of the creativeness of the designer actually comes from how these material perform and how do you actually establish on top of the personality and really honor it. So for my challenge is that how for these kind of information, the history of how the material has been and how the material performs has to be digitalized for the AI and then into some kind of latent space that human will be able to use it and play with it and maybe dive deeper than what you, like just the purely the metrics of patterns and numbers. So yeah, and that's my part, which make it also a complex system because you cannot directly see how the material performs without performing it. Yeah.
So just like also for our listener to really visualize how the work in the lab, your lab unfolds. How does it, so the human or you give numeric, like a number input into the AI? How can you
So
describe?
at the moment, I'm working with a domestic knitting machine that used to take punch cards, and we have hacked hardware that connects to the domestic knitting machine by sending signals, very simple signals like at this needle it will knit or the next needle it will not knit. So it's basically metrics of 0 and 1s. And then I have an interface that connects to the hardware that will decide every single line, like what signal to send in the next line, what combination of sequence of 0 and 1s to send. But you still have to become the person who pushed the carriage to knit it out. And then by that moment, because your choice of the material of the yarns that goes into the knitting machine and the pattern that's being sent from the computer to the knitting machine becomes the textile that's knitted. And I'm hooking up the AI system on the digital platform so the AI can be generating patterns and then you will be knitting it out. But then once you knit it out, you won't be, like when you're looking at the patterns on the interface, you won't be able to really envision what will come out of it because there are always accidents or personalities that is due to the temperature, the humidity, or the materiality of the yarn of that day.
Yeah, I think this is like both your project, like in this idea of, as you were defining it, honoring the personality of the materials. It's really like important in times of ecological emergencies, like in order to shift our approach to the environment. So the environment is very much alive, materials are very much alive, and materials and the environment. So as you were saying, the like the surface on which we are working or the climate and the humidity are co-creators or co-producers.
Yeah, and also what we were talking about before, it's also really about like material that information can also become material. And in that sense, like you only know, like through, at least for me, like through making it digital and then physical again, and then trying to look further how in the digital process you can do it better to enhance like the physical process. Then you can really like have that collaboration with the material.
Yeah, and also how do you record what happened?
Yeah.
And to be able to perform it again and have it highly controlled so you can really like emphasize on it.
Yeah.
And we go back to this idea of the archive that came up also like in podcast before, and also like it's very common like in the Future Materials Bank materials and materials project to see the materials as archives, as really like holding informations but being informations as well. Actually, like this makes me think about like a word that I must admit I didn't know before, but I encountered in these days, like wandering here in Eindhoven in the different pavilions of the Dutch Design Week, which is phygital, which is understood as like the fusion of physical and digital, and it taps into exactly what you are describing now. So like this space between the digital world and the embodied, the material world. How do you have you ever heard this word before?
I know it's just the first time here, but the concept is being like discussed a lot among my colleagues and people, and especially when everyone is being challenged by the generative AI these days. Like some people question whether people who like the physical world is the only part that you won't be too much challenged by the generative AI. Like if you work with the physical things, then your job will be safe, sort of. Yeah.
And I think like finding words and also finding ways to describe things also enables you to better understand them, especially with these kind of matters. Because at first I was also talking with you about like that actually 3D printing is maybe a bit more of like, it's a technique that's well understood and like also well managed and used a lot. And AI is much more like sort of black box, and people are either like really serving it or they have the idea that they are led by AI. So I think every way you can describe these kind of things better also helps you to eventually better understand them, sort of.
Yeah, and I think we also have to archive it some ways, because like you said, when you have a word for it, then you sort of have that in your cognitive map, then you know how to play with it. And with AI as well, like if you're able to digitalize it, somehow give it a location as information that's being labeled, then you will be able to explore its notion as well, like both digitally and then connected to the physical part. But that's also not an easy job, because what are you going to label? What are you going to annotate? And how can you record it? Because if it's in the screen, then you cannot touch it. Like Eline brought us these samples. I was looking at it, it's like, well, it feels completely different from looking at it. And I think you also mentioned some of the, like, the materiality of it, right?
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting when you try to, because I've also tried to digitally like imitate my materials, and then you start addressing variables in a digital world that usually are applied in a physical world.
Can you make an example, Eline, of these variables?
Well, I try to animate it, and then like for example, you have often like 40 different parameters for like the way it flows, and then I'm like, but I don't know, like in real life, 40 parameters for the way it flows. So I think it's also interesting that like trying to imitate things digitally makes you more aware of like the complexity of reality, and also like what so far the ecology of like the material is. Because, for example, for me, like the sheep is already by the way it's fed, like it's like creating a different kind of wool, and then like by the way like the filament is like pulled out of sometimes it's a bit thicker, sometimes it's a bit less pigment.
So for instance, if we look at these samples that we have here, I'm touching them right now, and they feel quite thick, and I see the wool has like some micro particles inside it. So like if you were to interpret the materiality of this sample, like which information are stored in there?
Yeah, first of all, also that like this wool is heather wool. It's from like sheep that go with like the herd over different fields of heather. And when they, for example, also when they have a baby or they need their nutrition for something else, then like the wool gets a bit thinner. So especially like also in the ends, you see like these thinner bits. Also, I chose to use like the upper wool and like the second layer of the coat together. So you can see that also in the difference, like that there's more fuzzy wool in between it as well. Yeah, and over it I have 3D printed like this pattern of heather itself with indigo, colored with indigo, and yeah, it's sandwiched between these two like bioplastic panels.
So these are quite like fibers that would be quite difficult to weave together. So
Yeah.
you hold them together via the 3D printer.
Yeah, yeah.
Pei, do they anyhow look something similar to the patterns that you and your AI companions come up with? Or that emerge?
No, but when Eline was talking about it, I was like thinking, well, if I have to create a database out of it, I feel like I have to also record the history of how the sheep was grown and kind of food they eat, because you were literally saying there's a relation between that and these, right?
Yeah.
So if I want to generate something, and if I like say after 30 years we only find the digital archive of this sample, I want to recreate it, perhaps I have to start with growing the sheaves in the right place.
Yeah, and also we were talking really about like also that sometimes there's a lot of information and you want to materialize it, and I feel like once there's, because we also talked about how important the visual outcome of experiments is, and then you said almost straight away, from what I can remember, that it wasn't that important, that you were like mainly interested in ecology. But since I was aware of like the sort of image of this specific wool, I was focused on creating a sort of aesthetic outcome that would be so different from what it used to be in the past, because that's why the wool isn't used. But I feel like also maybe in your project it's much more abstract, the information you're trying to visualize as well.
Yeah, because I'm trying to also create the cognitive space that we have. Like, how do you feel when your hand touched the material? And then there's something more there, right? You can, of course, create a very similar image of what you have the sample here. But then the wool, if the wool is different, then the way you touch it is going to be different. And I can also totally imagine if you're using the same kind of 3D printed filament dyed, printed on it, it might also perform differently.
Yeah. So that's interesting.
Would you imagine like an AI intervention into Eline's technique? Pei, like a fusion of... Yeah.
Well, because Eline mentioned that she was looking at what kind of texture of the yarn, the wool is, and I'm just thinking of the generative AI perspective. If we can sort of categorize, or not categorize, annotate, that's the right word, to annotate these, and then we can try to create something like other kind of concept, but with this texture, then it will really quickly help us to explore a lot of different possibilities if we are able to capture the essence of this wool.
Yeah, because actually the wool itself is already a sort of mapping of information, so that could be really interesting to work into patterns as well.
Yeah.
And this mapping of information is also like very important in order to rethink how we might relate in a more sustainable way to the environment. And before tapping into sustainability, I wanted you mentioned categories, but then it was more annotation of concept of information pay. I want actually like to ask both of you, like how you think your projects might redefine categories such as originality, creativity, because it's like sort of shifting and challenging some assumptions that we might have towards technology, towards materials, towards non-human agency.
Yeah, I think you're asking a very tricky question here because, at least in my case, if you're working with AI and the AI is generative, the question becomes how much agency you give it to the AI and how much you embrace it and how much you can develop something on top of the AI's perspective, which sometimes become really interesting. Like we all see some generative AI creating really bizarre aesthetics, taking what's existing, like for example, Stable Diffusion or Mid-Journey, for example. If you want further develop on those characteristics or those essence, then you create something that no one ever really like an aesthetic that no one really explored before. So I can totally also imagine that AI working with textile will also have something emerge from there, which is sort of already did. Like I did a bit of genetic algorithm or more the evolutional algorithms on the patterns, trying to create some new patterns. And they already started to become this very sophisticated but slightly organic, somewhere between older and disorder kind of looking, which is then as a human designer, you look at it and you wonder like how much should I embrace it and what should I select, what should I keep, and does that also change me? And I think that's when the creativity happens. But that's for my bit.
What about Eline? Do you have any unexpected patterns emerging from your...
Well, I was thinking about it also in relation to Pei's project, that actually there's like a lot of notion of tradition in textile, especially because I really started from the point of wanting to do something with this wool, and then of like I wasn't like per se reaching out to work with the 3D printer, but from experimenting it happened to be the best solution, sort of. And I think in textile it's really important to challenge these ideas of tradition, because it's such an old craft, and sometimes it can also phase you a bit, because then you think like, yeah, but everything is already done. And I feel like that thought is really like, that's the biggest block or wall you can walk against.
A lot has already been done, true, but also been forgotten in the meantime. But at the same time, I think like perhaps your projects are also hinting to a sort of paradigm shift, like really changing the way we might think about our handling and managing textiles and what textiles are. What do you think?
Yeah, I think working with, like in general, non-human entities, that they can always drag us from our current perspective and providing a very different perspective that we never really notice. And then when you're looking back from that angle, then you suddenly realize that there's a whole new world out there. Yeah.
Yeah. And we need also to be open to accept, right?
Yeah.
To embrace this new world.
Yeah,
perhaps.
Instead of calling it an error, you embrace it and say it's a nice surprise, and we work on it.
Yeah, I love that. It's actually something coming back very often in materials experimentation.
Yeah, not having yourself at the center of your... and that's in a way also kind of a relieving way of working, because if you allow the other parts of your project into it more, then it feels also like you get also something back from it. Like it's like you're putting this effort in and you're taking care of everything, but it's also taking care of you in your project, in your aims in a way. But yeah, that can only be if you like also leave room for these like errors or like mistakes or like unexpected outcomes.
Yeah, sometimes they help you to grow.
Yeah.
Can you just like just also for the audience to imagine how you work and what kind of errors might emerge. Do you have an example of one, something happening that really left you wordless or speechless or...
Yeah, I was working in this chemical lab to develop the filament with like the bioplastics, and they were a bit like, yeah, it's fine. We will show you how the machine works, and we don't understand at all why you would want to use this pigment, because there's all these like master batches, but they use synthetical and very harmful pigments. So that's why I wanted to introduce pigments usually used in textiles into the plastic. And then, like, I started to use the indigo, for example, and you need like such little amount, and then everybody was so surprised, and I was also really surprised because I didn't value, like, it was a sort of gas, like, to start working with it. But then, like,
indigo. If someone doesn't know what indigo is
like the pigment also that jeans is traditionally dyed with. It's a really stable and very beautiful pigment. But if you would dye textiles with it, you need quite some amount to dye a certain amount of textile, which makes it intensive because it has to be grown and extracted. So if you can like get more material colored with like less pigment, that is a really nice way of working. So, and then like the people from the lab were also really surprised because I was just looking at the color and following the color for like its aesthetic mainly also. And then like there was also this property of it being really like a strong color. So yeah, that's kind of nice, especially when your expectations are then very low at a certain moment. Yeah.
I love this idea of following the color.
Yeah.
What are you following? And which unexpected destination brings you?
Well, I guess I'm following the randomness of computer-generated sequence. And some of them can really make your knitting machine have difficulties. But then, like, sometimes it doesn't knit, or it starts to accumulate a lot of yarns on the same needle, which if you're designing the pattern of your hand, that you won't do that. But because the computers can generate patterns so fast and it can explore all different possibilities, and it shows you as a whole image, and you'll be looking at the pattern and thinking, well, it might be interesting to try. Turns out to be a really difficult job because that one wasn't really knittable in the way, but then you will find pockets of these kind of accumulations creating interesting 3D structure that you might want to play with it again. So for me, it's more of those. Yeah.
Fantastic. I think Eline and Pei, we reached the end of our episode, and we have like unpacked so many compelling topics such as the personality of the materials and how errors are actually like surprises and can lead to very unexpected ways, and then eventually also to shift our approach to the environment in these critical times. So I want to thank you very much for everything, and just remember our listener that if they want to re-listen to this episode, they can find it in all the most common podcast platforms, as well as on the Future Materials Bank, together with all the other episodes that we recorded at the Dutch Design Week 2023. Thank you very much, and until next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.